It's essentially the ability of the body to go back and forth in switching up its metabolism of fat and carbohydrate, back and forth, back and forth. And as we become less flexible, what happens is we're less able to burn carbohydrate. So we might be good at burning fat and not so good at burning carbs. So then those carbs go straight away into fat. So we do want a little bit of an alkaline urine for the release of certain biotransformed metabolites. So what foods do that? You know, usually a lot of the green leafy vegetables do that. And I had a number of people do this, and what they found was that the pH would go up, which speaks to we have to continually be connected to eating good foods. In traditional medicine, we know that bitters help us with detoxification. They help us to quell inflammatory pathways. And the more recent science is that we have these taste receptors for bitter all over our bodies. So it's almost like we can taste bitter on the tongue, but we can also taste it in the gut. We have those same taste receptors in our gut.
Hey everyone, it's Mike Mutzel here with HighIntensityHealth.com. Super excited to be live with Dr. Deanna Minich to talk about her new book, Whole Detox, which I've been reading actually in the sauna. That's why it looks a little bit beat up, but I thought it was apropos to really explore these different topics, Deanna, about detoxification while I was detoxing. And it actually
I was just going to say, you were doing the right thing with the right book.
Right. So what resonates and stands out to me, and I think our listeners when they purchase the book, is all the spectrum of colors.
Yeah.
So let's launch there and kind of talk about colors and the deeper meaning in our food and our health and how we can improve our body.
Oh, I love that question. And I can go on and on about color. I love color. I think I have to tell you a little bit about my personal story just so I can launch into how I got to this place of color, because I wasn't always into color. So when I was really young, I had a very health conscious mom, and she really got into food and faith in her own way. So everything was Richard Simmons, Adele Davis. I grew up in the 1970s, so it was very health nut-like. Right. Yeah. Which now looking back, I was thinking, wow, how cutting edge, how leading she was and a pioneer. So I had a lot of resistance to what she was doing with her food and faith. And so I really pushed back, and as a result, I had a lot of emotional eating issues because I grew up with all this very strict talk about food and what we could and couldn't have. So lots of problems and issues with my relationship with food. And eventually I went down this path of looking into other things. I had to start looking at other things because I wasn't drawn to the whole thing with food. It was kind of like this polarized issue. So I started getting into colors. I started painting wildly. And I remember I was in college and I would paint these paintings, and I have no artistic training whatsoever. I have no painting skills. I'm not trained in the art. I just was drawn to color, and I started seeing people as color. So I might meet somebody and I would think of them as, oh wow, that's kind of like a warming color person. They would look good in these colors, and color just infused my life.
Yeah.
So just doing all these pieces of art, making art, painting, and exploring it in that way, I then started to look into the science of color and started to see that there was a correlation. So everything I do now has color attached, whether it's looking at phytonutrients that are colorful, these pigments in food, or it's looking at the colors that we wear. I think that that's also really relevant, or the colors in our living environment, our living space. Colors have a physiological and a psychological impact, which is why I bring that into Whole Detox.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I mean, this room is very energizing, just speaking of the colors, and our listeners can see the couch is really red, and I love that. So is that why a standard American diet is so problematic when we think, because it really lacks color if we think about white bread and processed foods and stuff like that? Is that part of the reason that?
Yeah, well, I do. I think that is part of the reason. There was a study done some time ago looking at, I think it was 1,500 people, and they surveyed them on which colors they're getting in their food. And 8 out of 10 people had what they called a phytonutrient gap, meaning that 80% of people are not getting the full array of different colors, which means that they're really missing out. Because each of those colors in food correlate to certain parts of the body, certain functions. And so if we're not getting a certain color, we may be missing out on a certain organ system. We may be just shortchanging ourselves there. So yeah, I mean, I think that the colors of food are key in terms of being very attentive. So let me just ask you a question, because I'm curious if you know the answer to this. So in that survey, well, which color do you think people had to too few of in their diet. Which color was the one that was most deficient?
I'm just going to guess probably purple or blue, but I have no
idea. You got it, definitely. It was blue-purple. 88% of people had too short of the blue-purple color in their diets.
Wow, that's pretty interesting, because you have to eat kale or blueberries, and people think that that's gross maybe, or it's unavailable. So let's take a deep dive into color. You know, like you highlighted a story in your book here about a patient who was having fertility issues, and you recommended she eat a lot more carotenoids, and that helped with fertility, and that was really fascinating. So for people that are suffering from various condition-specific things, you have a great quiz where we can direct people to, but share with us some high hit rate colors and conditions that they may be helped by eating more colorful foods.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Well, yeah, let's start with orange, since you mentioned it. So if you look at orange, it correlates to beta carotene, which is, of course, one of the main carotenoids that we find in things like carrots or papaya or mangoes. I even did my master's thesis on carotenoids, so I know a lot about these hundreds of different compounds that are in plant foods. So what we see with beta carotene is that it plays a role in ovulation for women. So we need vitamin A, which beta carotene is the precursor to. And even if we look at the follicle as it's maturing in the ovary, you know when it gets to that place called corpus luteum, yellow body? It's yellow because of the retinol beta carotene connection. Wow. And then it becomes corpus albicans once it's fully developed. So it's part of the whole process. And if you look at some of the earlier studies, like they have studies with cows looking at increasing fertility, they would correlate progesterone levels with beta carotene levels in the body. There seemed to be a correlation there between the two. So we find a lot of that data in animals, and it just makes sense in people. But maybe that's not the full picture for everybody. For fertility, infertility, those two things are very multifaceted.
Right.
But I think that color in general, orange in this case, could help. And also for men, sperm quality and production can be influenced by beta carotene or just carotenoid levels overall in the body. Because in general, these are antioxidants, which are really protective.
Yeah. So in addition to carrots, what would you recommend if someone wanted variety there for carotenoids?
So if you think of autumn, when trees turn color, the leaves turn color, right? They go from green, then they kind of, the green breaks down into some of the other colors that are at the bottom, under that green color. You have red and yellow and orange. So even green foods have these carotenoids. They have those colors lurking within. So things like kale, things like tomatoes. I once did just an assessment looking at the USDA database just to see which foods have the highest level of carotenoids, and it was dehydrated carrots. So carrots really do come to the top.
Yeah.
Kale was up there, spinach was up there, tomatoes were up there. Basically, all plant foods are going to have some level of carotenoids. And one thing that I want to mention for your listeners too is that we need fat. We need fat to help with the absorption of those carotenoids, and we also need fat to help with fertility. It's so key. Having these omega-3 fats, which help with the flow and fluidity of the different things that are being transported within the body. So, and they also help to reduce inflammation, of course.
Yeah.
So there's a bigger picture there with fertility, but I do think that orange in general, there's something about it. Even in the animal kingdom, guppies, when they're ready to mate, they exhibit this orange color. They become very bright. Similar to the guppies is shrimp. They become even more orange when, it's like there's something about orange in the animal kingdom that connects to fertility.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think salmon too, when they're really that's more of a pinkish, but I know that they can be a little bit orange there. But let's go back to the purple and blue, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
And I think we were talking offline about the brain. So there's some research that purple and blue, I think, can help with cognitive function. We all want to keep our brains operating at a high level. So any data there and foods that we should be thinking of?
There is definitely some data there, and that data comes primarily from Tufts University, is to the best of my recollection. They had a number of different papers. James Joseph's group publishes a lot on things like strawberries, spinach, and blueberries for brain health. So some really nice data to show that these blue-purple compounds in food are not just antioxidants, right? Because antioxidants, what does that mean? It just means that they're protecting the body or the cells. but that these compounds make their way into certain parts of the brain that are responsible for learning and memory. So, and I know, Mike, that you have educated your audience very well on things like cell signaling and protein kinases. These blueberry compounds go in and change cell signaling patterns as it relates to brain activity. So it's not just a protective thing, there's a functional thing that really ties into that.
Fascinating, Deanna. So let's take a deep dive into some of the particular mechanisms that are or biochemical pathways that are upregulated here. Like, and a big one that Dr. Perlmutter and others talk about, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is that one?
It is one that is affected by the blueberry compounds. So there is some good research on that. You know, a lot of it is very in vitro and preliminary right now, but if we take the animal studies and start to extrapolate them to humans, what we would need in order to get those effects on learning and memory is just half a cup of blueberries a day.
Wow.
Which isn't a lot. You know, you can toss those into your smoothie and make sure that you're getting them in some way. And I think that that's even probably better, because then we're making sure that we're getting at the matrix of that fruit and really teasing it apart so that those compounds do get absorbed properly. So yeah, there are a number of different effects in the brain. Cell signaling, BDNF, antioxidant effects. They upregulate certain pathways as it relates to detox, just being protective. So overall, good stuff.
Love that. I want to go back to a lot of the things that we're talking about here, but if we don't talk about it now, I think we'll lose track. So you mentioned the smoothie, putting it in there, break it, so we get the whole food. Some people are kind of anti-smoothie because it's like processed and there's no satiety mechanisms, and I think there's a lot of research actually showing that smoothies do have satiety mechanisms, and one of the concepts in your book, you talk about soups. So let's talk about just the act of eating and processing of food. Are smoothies okay? Are soups okay? Why one or the other?
You know, I think the basic premise, me being in nutrition for 20 plus years now, what I have found to be really important is variety. So yeah, if you feel like a smoothie one day, I think that's great. I don't think we need to be doing smoothies every single day of our lives in order to be healthy. I think we have to pay attention to our body signals and where we're at with that. So soups I like, in part because much of that is already digested for us. So through the warmth, through breaking down a lot of the fibers, and then we get some of the synergy of those food compounds coming together. Barbara Rolls and some other people, some other researchers have done some nice research around eating soup and how when we eat soup, we tend to eat less food than if we were to have those same calories in the form of physical matter, like a sandwich or casserole. So there's something about the satiety of soup and how it gets us to slow down, maybe because it's warm, it's hot, so we actually have to take our time. And so we're signaling the brain in different ways. And within the Whole Detox program, when I'm focused on soups, I'm talking about the truth system, which is all around this mouth area. It's not just what we eat, it's how we eat. And I just want to comment to what you said about smoothies. One of the things, and you'll appreciate this because you're a big microbiome person, so one of the things with smoothies is I think we're gulping them and we're not really taking time to make sure that we're interacting with our microbiome in our mouth. So we're not breaking down those green pigments, those nitrates that are in our green leafy vegetables, to nitric oxide, and that is primarily done through bacteria, right? So we have the nitrates going to nitrites, going to NO, and so the bacteria, we start that process in the mouth. We don't want to wait until we get to the gut because we don't know all the interactions, right? So what I tell patients is chew your smoothies. Even if you have to spoon them out, do that in a very mindful way.
Oh, that's beautiful. Great advice, sir. Yeah, I think people do slam it or they're in the car, right? Because they make the smoothie at work or they put it in the shake, and so that's totally mindless. So that aspect is really, I mean, there's a lot of research there. Like everything that we're talking about, there's documented research showing that. And so mastication and a lot of good data on soups, and I like how you talked about that. But one thing that comes to mind, and we talked about this offline, is you mentioned cleaning the mouth. And we talked about truth and people that when they lie, they tend to have to go brush their teeth and do this over. So share with us, I think that's really important.
There is some interesting research around that. So just a few studies, and I believe they were done in Germany, around having people deliberately lie about something and then monitoring their choices on a task that would follow. So what they found versus a group that would lie, a truth-telling group, was that the lying group would feel the need to just get clean. They had to like brush their teeth or do something that would purify them. So I think it's an interesting concept, right? You know, we have this mechanism built into spiritual practices, you know, cleansing, purifying. I think for as long as humanity has been in existence, we've always had some kind of cleansing mechanism, because I think it's just part of who we are. You know, people say to me all the time, you know, Deanna, there's nothing to this detox. Our bodies are detoxing all the time. Why do we have to do anything special? But if you look over time at Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, what were they doing? Clays, panchakarma, saunas. You just did a sauna right before this, right? Right. All these different practices that were all about cleansing. And there were even herbs that were used as cathartics, emetics, you know, trying to get things out of the body. Bloodletting, if we go back that far. So we've always been about cleansing. I think it's just our human nature, whether we're telling lies or we just feel like it's time that we get a reset. It's time that we cleanse and just be renewed. And we have that even with the seasons, right? You know, I think about spring. That's the time of renewal. People usually do spring cleaning. We do those types of things and kind of move us through. I think nature guides us.
Yeah, beautiful. That's a great way to put it. So I want to take a deep dive into the spirituality, but let's finish off here with some of the biochemical detoxification aspects. And some of the, you said in your book, you know, and people I think know this, on some level, that our bodies are constantly detoxifying, right? Like our livers right now, and everyone listening, our phase 2 detox enzymes are churning, hopefully, right? But you offer some tips for people to help upregulate that with the phytonutrients that we've been talking about, but parsley, cilantro, and you talk about, I think about, help me here with some other ones. There was sesame was interesting.
Sesame is a great one, especially for people with fatty liver. So what's happening in this day and age is we're getting a lot of metabolic issues, and the liver takes on the brunt of a lot of that. And so the way that the liver takes that on is it becomes fatty, just becomes infiltrated with fat. And then it just doesn't work very well, especially for detox, because that's one of the hubs for detoxification in our bodies. So sesame seed oil. So there's something in sesame, there's a compound called sesamin. So you can get it from the seed, that helps with oxidation of fat in the liver. So I make sure that I bring in sesame as part of the Whole Detox program in the recipes, you know, because I don't think that people get enough sesame. And it's not like we have to inundate ourselves, but just bringing that in. Some other things that help would be teas, pomegranates, all the different greens, bitters. You like bitters. And bitters are great for really purging the liver of toxins. And just to speak to what you said about, you know, hopefully we're all just sitting here with our phase 2 process happening in our livers. It's variable. You know, certain things are going to turn on phase 2, which is part of the process of detoxification that occurs in the liver and also in other parts of the body. But not for everybody. It's not going to be as efficient. So if we're stressed, we have a fatty liver, and many people do these days. We've got lots of buildup, lots of stagnation in various ways. I even think of emotional stagnation. Probably we're not working as well.
Wow.
So, you know, this is the age of personalized nutrition, personalized genomics, and detox is one of those areas that I see a great synergy between genomics and nutrition. Yeah. So I think that, you know, when people come at us and say, well, there's no reason to detox, I think that really the more sophisticated response back is, but we're all so different. We have individual biochemistry, different functioning of enzymes depending on what we're doing, what we're eating, how we're living, how we're stressed. We can't imagine that we're always just operating like that. We're going to have this.
Oh, that is so powerful. It's kind of, but also we know a lot about the detoxification genomics too.
Yeah, we
right?
do.
I mean, because of pharmacology, so we can easily test for that and have a really good snapshot into, you know, what our susceptibilities and strengths would be, which is pretty interesting. So you mentioned bitters. I would love to take a deep dive into that, because that feeds into this whole equation of affecting cellular expression, genomics and so forth, but also satiety, and we can get into the microbiome. But give us your overview and kind of big picture snapshot on bitters.
Well, let me just relay a little story before we dive into that science. I was in Nepal traveling probably about 10 years ago now, and one of the things that I noticed when I was eating in the different restaurants was that instead of just having a big chunk of something, we had these little bowls of the different sauces and the food. So there was it was almost like an artist's palette we had all these little cups, and they all had different flavors, like a chutney, which was kind of sweet, and then there was something that was kind of sour, something that was kind of bitter. And so it was great because it really opened up my nutritional vision to just feeling satisfied after those meals. I felt like, oh, I'm not craving anything sweet. I'm not craving anything savory. So, and I think that we've lost that in our culture. We've gravitated towards things that are fat, salty, and sweet, and we haven't gone with the complexity, the whole picture. So with bitters, I think we're starting to see a resurgence of people getting more into bitters, and it's because, in part, I hope, of the science of what we know about bitters. In traditional medicine, we know that bitters help us with detoxification. They help us to quell inflammatory pathways. And the more recent science, if we look at what's been going on more in your terrain, which is metabolism in the gut, is that we have these taste receptors for bitter all over our bodies. So it's almost like we can taste bitter on the tongue, but we can also taste it in the gut. We have those same taste receptors in our guts. So then you can ask, what are we doing tasting in our guts? How did that happen? Well, these receptors, and there are like 25 different varieties of them, and we can have genetic variability in them. You know, what you were just speaking to with detox and with SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, we can see that as well in bitter receptors. So not all of us are going to taste and respond to bitters in the same way. If I think of children, they tend to be really sensitive. You probably know this with your daughter, right? How kids are just going to be like, blech, that's bad. You know, I don't want to eat any more of that. And that's part of the reason why they don't like vegetables. You know, that their taste buds are so sensitized that they can't tolerate so much. So what we know about the literature now, based on these bitter receptors, which are in our guts, in our reproductive tract, in our airway tract, and even in our brain. I find that that's really fascinating. And I don't think we know enough about that. That when we are super tasting bitter, so let's just say I'm a super taster and you don't taste bitter very much, that can connect to our metabolism. Super tasters tend to have lower body weight, lower fat mass, and just in general be more metabolically flexible versus people that aren't tasters of bitter. So there are different ways to test that out. Like, you know, there are these strips, you can even buy them from Amazon, where you can test out your bitter capacity, but most people know, you know if you're really a sensitive bitter taster or not.
Yeah. So for you, dandelion greens would be a no-no? Like that would be too powerful for you? Is that what we're saying? A super taster?
Super taster would find dandelion greens very bitter. It would be hard to have those dandelion greens.
I see.
Another bitter would be even green tea. For some people, that's really bitter, especially if it steeps too long. Then you have all those catechins that are released, and those are considered to be bitter. Soy isoflavones, soy products, there are certain components that are thought to be bitter. You think of beer. Hops from beer is considered to also be part of the bitter family.
So in your book you mentioned microgreens. Is that because everyone is so unique, but you want people to have some bitters, but not everyone's going to enjoy them, so just sprinkle them through that? I mean, is that sort of why you mentioned microgreens? Or?
Well, when people go through Whole Detox, especially in the first 7 to 10 days, what I've noticed is that taste perception changes. So things become more sweet, more bitter, more sour. It's almost like everything is amped up. So what I would say is just be in tune with your body in terms of where you need to be. Get a variety of different tastes, because chances are you're going to be changing those receptors in different ways.
Wow. That's pretty fascinating stuff. Now, a little while back, you talked about metabolic flexibility, and I think that's important to discuss now because ketosis and high-fat diets are pretty popular, and we have so much of our population is insulin-resistant and pre-diabetic, and they're metabolically inflexible.
Yeah.
So what's the importance of being metabolically flexible?
Well, first let's define the term, right? Because I know I like the sound of it, but I'm not sure if, scientists have one version of what they refer to it as well as clinicians. So the way that I know metabolic flexibility is it's essentially the ability of the body to go back and forth in switching up its metabolism of fat and carbohydrate, back and forth, back and forth. And as we become less flexible, what happens is we're less able to burn carbohydrate. So we might be good at burning fat and not so good at burning carbs. So then those carbs go straight away into fat. So then we start getting fatty infiltration of liver and muscle, and those are the insulin-sensitive tissues. So we want to be flexible. One of the things that I learned from writing Whole Detox was the key to successful aging and really being vital is being fluid and flexible. And so I think about that in the three major body systems. I think about that in the brain with neuronal plasticity, and I know that you've heard that term. So being neuronally wired where things are just moving quickly, which is why we like omega-3s. Then I think of the heart. I think of heart rate variability. We want increased variability. We want to be able to respond to a situation very quickly, right? And have that autonomic nervous system balance in so doing. And then in the gut, it's metabolic flexibility. It's that sense of flow and having that sense of knowing when to switch our metabolic pathways. And Dr. Bland and I did some work on that together. We even wrote a review on that, looking at all the different nutrients, things like berberine, things like, so many of them, ginseng, cinnamon, all these different ones which help us with metabolic flexibility because they're tapping into those individual cell signaling pathways that are allowing us to burn fuel correctly.
No, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's great. You highlight these in the book as well. And one thing that you and Dr. Bland talked about was being in an alkaline state. And you talk about this in the book and the importance of alkalinity for proper detoxification. And I think that's people are not talking about that. I think it's really important how the enzymes need to be in the right pH so your body can eliminate the toxins. You want to speak to that?
It's true. Well, I think we need acid and alkaline. And the body is supposed to have its wisdom to make those compartments in those ranges. Like the stomach likes a really acidic pH. And if we look at the rest of the body, if we look at the blood, it's right there on the border, right? 7.5 around that area. So one of the things that he and I were looking into is how does taking in certain foods change our alkaline status as assessed through the urine. So you can do that through the saliva, you can do it through blood. The blood is always going to stay very constant. It's very tightly regulated. But things like saliva and urine are not. They have a much more broad range. So one of the things that I remember is when I was working with this concept and exploring it more, because there's not a lot of science. There's some science in pharmacokinetics as it relates to the release of certain metabolites through kidney resorption. And so as part of that resorption process, so when a toxin is being filtered out of the kidneys through the tubule, it has the opportunity to be taken back up into the body, similar to the gut. And if we don't have the proper pH, then it may be taken back up. So we do want a little bit of an alkaline urine for the release of certain biotransformed metabolites. So, so what foods do that? Usually a lot of the green leafy vegetables do that. And I tested myself, and you can test yourself. Everybody can do this. You buy some pH strips, and you can do that at a pharmacy or just even online. Very easy, very accessible. You sit down with a plate of broccoli that you've steamed, and it's all bright green. You eat it, and then for about 4 hours thereafter, don't eat anything, don't stress yourself, just kind of lay low, and take the pH of your urine all throughout that time. Because I had a number of people do this, and what they found was that the pH would go up. So the urinary pH is usually about 5.5 to 6.5, and what I saw were increases all the way to 8
of
the pH of the urine. But it starts to go back to its normal pH usually after that 4-hour time frame, which speaks to we have to continually be connected to eating good foods. Just doing it one time a day is good. We have to start somewhere, but it's much better if we can do it incrementally.
And you talk about in the book too, eating for your intuitive eating, not just eating because you heard that it was good to eat every 2 to 3 hours, but really getting in tune with your body. And if you're not hungry, then don't eat. And so that I guess this is a two-part question, and we can tie in intermittent fasting and how that kind of affects metabolic flexibility. And should people skip breakfast or should they skip dinner? And I think you're a big fan of fasting for 12 hours. So maybe let's talk about those two, intuitive eating and fasting, and kind of the science we should know.
So in Whole Detox, I talk about intuitive eating when we talk about the insight, which is all about being connected to your sense of intuition. So when I'm talking about intuitive eating, it's rather than go to a prescriptive protocol, throughout your life, eating in a certain way, as somebody has mentioned to you, or some formulaic approach. It's really just being in tune with that moment and really centering, being grounded, and then assessing what do I need to eat now, if anything, and knowing when it's time to stop if you are eating. And that's not easy for a lot of people. In fact, many people with chronic diseases are out of that sense of intuitive eating and those impulses we have. So I think doing a program to get a little bit more balance before we tune into that, because sometimes it's not our intuition. Sometimes it's pathology talking. So we have to make sense of, is it intuition or is it pathology? Well, if it's for a cookie, a brownie, or something, you can probably surmise that it's probably more the pathology than the intuition. Right. And as far as intermittent fasting, we talk about that within Whole Detox in the spirit phase, which is all about letting go of some food. And we do that at the end of the program. So I do talk about a 14 to 16 hour fast. Not everybody can do that, in which case a 12-hour fast is also really fantastic. I think just giving our mitochondria, our bodies a break, even our gut a break from the continual processing of food is so important.
Now, for practical purposes, do you recommend doing that at night? Like having an early dinner and then just not having any snacks and kind of a later breakfast? Or with your clients that you've worked with, I know you have a lot of great stories here. What have you found in terms of compliance and clinical success?
It really depends on the person. Some people are more night people and they're not breakfast eaters. You know, I have a number of clients that I've had over the years who say, I'm not hungry in the morning. So I work with their rhythm. And sometimes that rhythm will change, where now they start changing their metabolism, their metabolic pathways through the intermittent fasting, and they start re-regulating. So I think it's very different for everybody. But I would say, just as a general rule of thumb, I think it's good for people to work with practitioners on this kind of stuff, because if they do have a chronic disease like type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, you just have to be pretty much in tune with what's happening in the body, right? So you don't want to go on anything that's extreme. But a little bit of, you know, even for myself personally, what I try to do is a couple of days a week. I don't do it every day, but a couple of days a week, just do that 14-hour fast. So yes, having my last meal at 7 and then not eating again until 9 in the morning, which isn't too difficult to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of those good stressors. And we talked about the sauna kind of jokingly, but like thermal stress and, you know, social stress, like giving a presentation in front of a group, exercise stress, and then, you know, going without food and seeing if your body can react and upregulate those pathways, I think. We
call that xenohormesis, as you know.
Yeah.
It makes good sense. And that's, I think, too, what a detox can do for people, is give them that little bit of stress where they withdraw from things. But with Whole Detox, I also bring in a lot of things. And I think many times with detoxes, we think so much about the withdrawal, which is good because it's a hormetic effect. But then what do we replete and what do we replace with? And how do people feel nourished in the process? So I think that's, you know, it's the yin and the yang. It's a way to bring them both into balance.
That's awesome, Deanna. One of the things that you talked about removing and adding things to the equation, and what you add to this whole conversation of detoxification is the mind, body, spirit. And I know I'm going to get this wrong, but you said something to the effect in your book about you can eat the best diet in the world, but if you're saying negative things in your mind and thinking negative thoughts, you're probably going to express some sort of symptoms of dis-ease. So let's kind of give our listeners an overview of the mind, body, spirit and how to optimize that.
Yeah, great question. The science would tell us that there's no separation between mind and body, that the two are so interconnected. So if I'm sitting there with this plate of greens, colorful plate, all nutritious food, but yet I'm thinking very toxic thoughts, or I just had an exchange with somebody and I just have all these feelings coming out, then I'm not really getting the full benefit of that meal. Or if I'm eating a plate of junk and I have great thoughts, you know, it's just not a complete picture, right? So body and mind really need to operate as one. And I think that that's where we see the most synergy and the best healing potential. So what can people do, right? Because it's not easy just to wipe your mind clean of all those toxic thoughts, but you have to start somewhere. So within Whole Detox, one of the things that I do is I do focus on limiting thoughts. Everybody has them. And in fact, we share limiting thoughts, whether it's I'm not worthy, I'm not enough, I'm not, fill in the blank, whatever it is. I'm not blank enough, good enough, pretty enough, smart enough, fit enough, whatever it is, right? We always have that place of lack. And then from there, trying to figure out what can we fill that with? What is an affirmation? What is a visualization? What is something to bring us into that place of feeling alive, feeling like we are complete? So I think that this one is something that, you know, it's a lifelong process. It's nothing that we completely erase. I know that when I was doing a lot of work for myself on affirmations, and again, everything that I talk about in Whole Detox, it's really from my own personal journey. So the emotional issues I had and how I worked with affirmations, I would have them all over the house on sticky notes. I had them on the steering wheel of my car. I had one that said joy, because I was just feeling so much road rage and just, I was commuting and it just wasn't having fun on the road. So, I was placing these words everywhere to try to reprogram my subconscious. Because most of our actions are from our subconscious. They're not even from our conscious mind. And it takes work to get into that space and to start changing it.
Yeah, it's so much easier to go to the gym or take a pill or go to the grocery store and buy health food. And so that's what I love, this conversation that you're kind of evolving and pushing the paradigm forward about detoxification, this whole spectrum of health. It starts with the mind too. So let's talk, you mentioned affirmations, and I think that's beautiful, putting sticky notes and vision boards and things, but what have you found to be effective for people? Like, do you start with yoga and meditation? I think yoga was really profound for you. Heart math, to kind of get reconnected, where would you guide people?
Yeah, I see it as a buffet. Since I'm a nutritionist, I'm always thinking in terms of food. So I see it as a buffet. And I see 7 things in that buffet. And I would say to you, Mike, what do you feel drawn to? Is it doing some emotional work, doing some work on thoughts, and really personalizing the process, which is why I have the spectrum quiz for people to kind of get into that space and figure out which color is imbalanced. And then based on the color, then they can go to that modality. So I think it just depends. For me, it was art and yoga, but for somebody else, that would not be their path. So they have to find, just which of these 7 areas can they start with. And for some people, it's as simple as a 5-minute period of silence. Maybe it's not even meditation. I have some friends, some practitioners even, who have such a busy mind that they couldn't even think about meditating.
Right.
So that's not their thing, but maybe meditation for them is taking a walk in the forest, or maybe it's knitting. I see people sometimes on lectures and, they're kind of in the zone of just, they're quilting, knitting, and crafting, but it's their right brain, left brain are working together. So, what I would say is start small. And if we look at toxicity as anything that stands in the way of our growth and our health and our potential, then what is one small thing that we could do in order to release that barrier or just soften it a bit? So maybe it's buying purified water, getting a filter at home for your water system, or maybe it's starting to say no to commitments that come your way. There are all different things that one can do. I know that in Whole Detox, I have it laid out so that it's very programmatic, so that people can start to get acquainted with these different modalities to see what they feel drawn towards. Some people haven't had that degree of sampling of all these different techniques, and then with the community sharing in that experience. It's fun.
That's beautiful. Let's talk about the practicalities of community. So does that mean, what I've used with some of my clients is telling them to put everything on social media. So when you start eating healthy food or exercising, put it out there, and so that you attract people, but also you make the private public, and so it has some accountability factor. But when you speak about community, what are some practical ways that people can increase community in their life?
Yeah. Well, first they have to know which communities they have in their lives. So just making a list. So is it a church community? Is it a book club? Is it a meetup group? Is it a functional medicine community? We all have, is it a friend network that all goes hiking together every year? Is it family? Is it pets? We have all these communities. So first understanding which communities we have, and then thinking about how often we interface with them. Do I need to increase my frequency of my visits, or do I feel nourished when I see that person? And really starting to figure out where we have those nourishing communities and where we have unsupportive communities. So there's that term sociogenomics, right? So socio meaning society or social networks influencing our genome. And I think it really is powerful to really look very carefully at who we are connected to, even on social media. And I've even been doing this with my emails, and I look at, what's in my inbox? Do I need to subscribe, unsubscribe? Everything that comes your way, just be evaluating, because you're connecting into these communities. So even when we align to a certain eating style, if I was a vegan or a paleo, there are certain communities around eating. And I think in part that's why people love to follow a diet, because it gives them a community. Yeah. And we're just at loss for a community, I think, in this day and age. We really don't have that sense of bonding like we have, because people live so far away and there's so much going on in everybody's lives. And so just doing one small thing, like for example, for me, when I first moved here, and I live in a more rural area, as you know, I started a meetup group because I was thinking I need to find other people that are into eating and living. So why don't I create a meetup group around healthy eating and living? And that's what I called it. Awesome. So I connected with, and I think I have like 115 different people in this meetup group. Who would have thought, in where I live, that there would be all these people that are interested. So sometimes we have to put forth the effort. Sometimes we have to go and find those inroads, because social isolation and being lonely, if we look at the science, leads to chronic disease. It leads to inflammation in the body. Mm-hmm. So we want good social healthy networks.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we talked about with toxic thoughts. I mean, you can eat the best food in the world, but if you're just isolated, it's going to be a problem, for your biochemistry. So I love it, Deanna. We have a couple final questions that we ask every guest on the show, but before we do, anything that we didn't get to share or discuss that you want to, kind of parting words maybe about your book? I know you have a quiz and stuff like that where people can learn a little bit more about that. But
yeah, that would be one thing if people want to see kind of how everything moves and how it's in motion in their lives. Go to whole-detox.com. You'll see an option for a quiz. You can just do it online, and then you'll get at the end a little graph, and it'll show you where you stack up. And then you can download a report that will help you to make sense of all these different areas. And of course, buying Whole Detox and kind of understanding a little bit deeper what you can do with some strategies would be good too.
Love it. Yeah, so we'll have the links to that quiz also and your book on highintensityhealth.com/drminich. So let's have some fun here. Final question. So we want to get to know you a little bit better.
We should have done this to start.
Yeah. So let's talk about your morning routine. So
Okay.
You have a very successful practice. You're an author. You coach a lot of practitioners. We want to know kind of what you do in the morning and how that sets the blueprint for your day.
One thing I do is I make sure I get enough sleep. So I do sleep my 8 to 9 hours a night. I try not to let anything stand in the way. And before I wake up, I'm laying in bed and I'm really just kind of doing a body scan and just really coming into that place of being centered and grounded. After that, I would say I just kind of, it depends. Sometimes I'll just go, I'm hungry and I want some kind of food after that, and so I'll go into the kitchen, I'll make something, or I'll take a shower, or I'll jump on email a little bit, or I'll go for a walk outside. I don't like to get too regimented with things because then you kind of get set in this groove, right? And I like to keep my neurons plastic, so it could be any number of things.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
You keep it variable. Yeah, some people are very routine, structure-based, and some people, I think that's awesome.
Well, when I was in school, I was like that because I had to be.
Right.
But if I don't have to be, I would much rather kind of go with where I'm at, and not everybody has that luxury, but I kind of like just kind of feeling out where I'm at. Do I need to go for a walk or do I need a smoothie?
That's really cool. It goes back to like being metabolically flexible.
Yeah.
Your routine is flexible. That's great. So if there was one herb, nutrient, or botanical that you just could not live without, this could be a specific ingredient in a supplement, this can be a piece of whole food, just something that you would frequently recommend your clients or people and that you personally just couldn't live without?
Wow. I have this principle or this philosophy around supplements that I believe it's really important to not get stuck in the groove of taking any one thing all the time. I think it's good to have like 3 weeks on, 1 week off. And so I like to do this with my body as well, because I just have a sense that my body's just not recognizing things as well if I'm doing it all the time. So that's a difficult question, but I suppose if you were to say, like if I was stranded on a desert island and I really only had one thing to take, I would be probiotics. I would be getting my vitamin D, so I don't have to think about that. But there's something about probiotics that I just think, safer for many people, and it's so pivotal to our whole physiology and psychology, actually.
Yeah.
So probiotics.
Love it. That's really great. Any strain or genre in particular that you're excited about because how it affects detoxification, perhaps, or mood?
That's a good question. There are some studies now that show that probiotics can help with detoxifying heavy metals. Wow. So there was even a study of Tanzanian women where the women that had the yogurt with the probiotic had less mercury and arsenic, and I believe even lead, than the group that did not have the probiotic yogurt.
Wow.
So I think about that. As far as a specific strain, again, if we're into flexibility and variability, I like multi-strain. The ones that I have are all multi-strain. But I do think that for certain chronic conditions, it might be good to target just like one strain if there's good science on it. But as far as just picking my favorite strain, I think that, again, it's about the community.
Yeah, I love that. That's really awesome. So Deanna, final question here. If you were to bump shoulders with Barack Obama in an elevator, or a future president, or someone from the World Health Organization, and you just had 30 seconds to share with them one lifestyle or health tip, bend their ear a little bit, what would that health or lifestyle tip be and why?
Colorful food to everybody. It's such an easy thing that we can do for the whole country, is just to target more colorful food in schools, in hospitals. Oh my gosh, enough of the brown, yellow, and white foods. And let's give kids and people that need it a full array of different foods. And if I had time with him to go on to say clean, colorful foods, I would do that too.
Right.
How do we clean up and get rid of a lot of these toxic chemicals in our environment, get rid of Roundup, get rid of GMOs, let's clean up our food supply and let's make it colorful. That's what I would say to him. And I bet he would agree.
Yeah, we hope. That's amazing, Deanna. So I really love talking with you. Your book is awesome, Whole Detox. Folks can get the show notes and links about this. But also, if people want to connect with you online, you have a couple different websites. You mentioned whole-detox.com, but how else can people learn more about your work?
Sure. DeannaMinich.com is the website that has all the stuff that I'm doing these days. But yeah, if you want more information on just Whole Detox, whole-detox.com. You can do the quiz, you can order the book. It's all right there.
Awesome.
And find me on Facebook too. I've got great tips there. I've got a Whole Detox page, as well as my Deanna Minich page, and I love just posting a variety of different things, inspirational and informational.
Yeah, it's very colorful too, by the way.
Of course.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for coming on, Deanna.
Really thank you. Appreciate it.